When you travel to Europe, say Paris for instance, and decide to visit some place like the Eiffel Tower, chances are you'll be warned of a group of strange people who may accidentally bump into you while sneakily taking your wallet, or who may be sitting on the curb with a suspiciously peaceful sleeping dog begging for money. These people may be darker than your average European, and may be dressed in exotic clothes. They may be fortune tellers, dancers, musicians, nomads. They have a long history and a rich culture. They are the Roma, or Gypsies. These people have undoubtedly been subjected to the longest-running case of systematic oppression in Europe. From their origins on the Silk Road to the Holocaust up until today, the Roma have been treated as an other, as an undesirable race of thieves and vagrants, despite being a peaceful people. Why is this? In order to understand, we must take a step back in time to northern India, around 1000 CE. India had become a religious battleground, as Islamic Arabs from the west clashed with the local Hindus. These warriors were a nearly unstoppable force, effectively crushing Hindu resistance and claiming land that is now Pakistan and Punjab, northern India for Allah. They destroyed Hindu tradition and forced assimilation into Islam. Those who resisted were forced west, wandering from country to country, from culture to culture. Their exodus had taken them through Persia, across Turkey, into Europe, and as far west as Britain, and as far north as Russia. A small number traversed the northern coastline of Africa to Egypt, where they may have joined the Moors in the invasion of Spain. They traveled along the Silk Road and peddled their own wares, played music and danced. They lived out of covered caravans and off of nature. They mastered the magical art of storytelling. They intermingled with the local people, growing larger in size and in influence. They would absorb part of whichever culture they might be passing through, which can be best seen through their language. These people are known as the Dom, and later the Rom. Medieval Europeans were more curious than anything about these strange people with dark skin and black hair, who sold foreign goods and sang strange songs from a far-off land. They were entranced by the mystique of their stories and legends, ones that were so different than their own, and believed these wanderers possessed magical powers such as divination and the ability to travel through astral projection. The Roma learned to play into the Europeans' enchantment and told the people they were on a long pilgrimage or some kind of royalty, earning the reverence of peasants and the protection of Christian kings. However, such privilege was short-lived as xenophobia and racism took hold. The first ever record of gypsies is by a monk in Ireland in the 12th century, who claimed that these vagabonds were Egyptian, and described them as descendants of Cain. As it turns out, gypsy is a variation of the Middle English word for Egyptian, Egyptian, or Jussian for short. Curiosity soon became contempt as this sentiment spread, as Egyptians were Moors and Moors were Muslim, and Muslims hated Christians. So the Christians hated the Muslims. It was only natural that they hated the gypsies. However, as we've covered, this is not true. The Roma are migrants from India. It was only until this past decade that the Roma's true Indian origin was confirmed by scientists in a series of genetic tests, linking most, if not all, Roma groups to the Punjab religion. Additionally, linguistic anthropologists came to the same conclusion after studying the varying Romani languages. Back to this growing trend of oppression, the Roma were beginning to be seen in a negative light by peasants. They set up camp just outside of towns, where the men would sell horses and silver, while the women sold fortunes and thick accents. They enjoyed the short-lived attention and curiosity, and then would be on their way to the next town. Outcast seemingly by choice, peasants were wary of them, and probably for a just reason, as the gypsies were slowly gaining the reputation of thieves, pickpockets, and magicians. In addition, the Catholic Church decreed them as blasphemous heretics. Gypsies who wanted to become Christians upon entering Europe were rejected by the Church. The Archbishop Petri of Sweden decreed in 1560, "The priest shall not concern himself with the gypsies. He shall neither bury their corpses nor Christian their children." Priests in Magdeburg were ordered not to baptize gypsy children without obtaining higher authorization. Gypsies were rejected by the Church for two major reasons. The first, which may have been accurate, was that the main motive for their conversion was an expedient to greater acceptance by the European peoples. The second was that from their first arrival, the gypsies began to have a strong influence over certain classes of people. These people associated a certain magic with the gypsies, and were attracted by their fortune-telling and palmistry. While the Church looked at the gypsies as an unorthodox people, they in truth felt threatened by the palmists, who were now competing with the priests for the superstitious minds of the peasant, as well as the upper-class population during this period of the Middle Ages. In France, during the 16th century, those who had had their palms read by gypsies were excommunicated or forced to do penance. Thanks to these superstitions and beliefs, Europeans developed the sentiment, "If you are not with us, you're against us," and began using the Roma as a scapegoat in times of economic trouble, and were seen as undeserving of any benefits of the state or profits they made. Spain became the first country to issue an edict against the Gypsies in 1490, prohibiting their dress, language, and customs in an effort to forcibly assimilate them. The Roma did comply to some extent, but still kept their culture and traditions and practiced them at a lower degree. France and England enacted expulsion orders in the 1530s, and many countries in Central Europe forced the Gypsies into slavery, leaving them no choice but to continue their nomadic existence, constant outsiders and constantly hated. Despite the stereotype that the Roma were, in fact, an intruder in the rhythmic European way of life, the Roma were actually quite involved in society. While they did not have a permanent home, they would return seasonally to the same town, pick up any work that had to be done, and participate in town social events. Additionally, the Roma would adopt the religion and certain aspects of the region. They were a peaceful people who followed their customs and were hardly as malicious towards their hosts as their hosts were towards them. Still, the majority of Europeans saw Roma as outsiders, separate from the innovations of Europe, and governments continued to put an end to their ways. However, there were rare occasions where gypsies were celebrated instead of despised. For example, in 19th century Britain, a movement appeared where scholars would study Roma societies and their culture. These gypsyologists argued that gypsies were in fact a pure, unadulterated people, untouched by the advances of European society thanks to their aversion to intercultural marriage. One gypsyologist, Arthur Symons, argued against the assimilation by saying, "Why are we setting ourselves the impossible task of spoiling the gypsies? They stand for the will of freedom, for friendship with nature, for the open air, for change in the sight of many lands, for all of us that are in protest against the progress. The gypsies represent nature before civilization, the lost romance left in the world." Gypsyologists also developed a racial hierarchy that placed pure gypsies at the top, half gypsies in the middle, and regular Europeans or mumpers at the bottom. Just as the philosophes of France romanticized the Indians of the Caribbean, painting a primitive society as an unattainable utopia, gypsyologists failed to recognize that many Roma lived in poverty in the ghettos of society, and while they were different, they were no better nor worse than English peasants. This, of course, directly contrasts the German Nazi movement of the 20th century. Intoxicated by the idea of the Aryan or master race, the Nazis set out to exterminate anyone who did not fit the bill of good health, blonde hair, and blue eyes. The Gypsies, second only to the Jews, were championed as the anti-Aryan and were dealt with accordingly. They were accused of many crimes that the Jews were also blamed for, including such things as child abduction and cannibalism. They were also often simply killed on sight. When World War II was over, an estimated 500,000 to 1,500,000 Gypsies had perished at the hands of the Nazis. Sadly, the oppression didn't end there. Even after facing the horror of the Nazi death camps, the Gypsies continued to be marginalized in post-war Europe, and still have to deal with discrimination, exclusion, and isolation to this day. European Gypsies are often forced to live in ramshackle settlements, and are denied adequate medical care and employment opportunities due to their ethnicity. Partially because of this, the average Gypsy lifespan is 10 to 15 years shorter than the overall European average. Robert Kushin of the European Roma Rights Center in Hungary explains how serious the discrimination against Gypsies in Europe really is.
There's a continued, persistent segregation of Romani children in schools. The Roma Rights Center just published a report on showing that there's a disproportionate number of Romani children who end up in state care institutions throughout Europe, both Eastern Europe and Western Europe. The problem of violence against Roma and an inadequate state response to violence is still one that needs to be addressed.
According to Roma filmmaker Tony Gatliff, the Roma people aren't looking for a country. They just want the right to live for a time in the areas they are passing through. The time to allow a woman to give birth to a child, to let horses or cattle rest, to wait out a winter. Everybody in this world has their place. The Gypsies want theirs too. While they are not the average citizen, they in no way deserve to be oppressed in the same ways their ancestors were 1,000 years ago. They are a resilient people who have managed to stay true to their culture and traditions despite the extreme pressures to assimilate.